दिल धन्यवाद UDSF को ये टॉक ऑर्गेनाइज करने के लिए और मुझे आमंत्रित करने के लिए। बहुत अच्छा लगा सब कुछ सुन के। मेरे लिए ये सीखने का ज़्यादा मौका है ना कि सिखाने का, पर जो भी मैंने थोड़ा अध्ययन किया है और जो जिस तरह से टॉपिक था कि रिजर्वेशन से आगे क्या, उसको मद्देनजर रखते हुए मैं बात करूँगा। अगर हमारे विदेशी दोस्त नहीं है तो मैं हिंदी इंग्लिश दोनों में बोलने का प्रयास करूँगा, लेकिन अगर वो आ रहे हैं तो देन आई कंटिन्यू इंग्लिश, जैसे कि वो आ गए हैं। तो हालांकि मुझे हिंदी में बोलने का बहुत मौके नहीं मिलते हैं और मुझे हिंदी बोलने का बहुत मन करता है। Anyways, I'm going to speak in English and switch between English and Hindi if that's possible. तो अम्बेडकर साहब के बारे में जितना कहा जाए, जितना पढ़ा जाए कम है। सॉरी, कंप्लीटली क्या करें, हमारे विदेशी दोस्त बैठे। So what I'm going to talk about is really try and talk about something beyond reservation, and this is something which I've been working on for the last 5 years, which is the idea of reparations and why we should start thinking about reparations and move a little ahead from reservation. And I'm going to make a case for Dalit reparations. That is not saying that you cannot make a case for tribal reparation, lower OBC reparation, reparation for nomadic tribes or denotified tribes, any community which has been historically excluded, discriminated, suppressed during colonial times, before colonial times, and continue to be oppressed disproportionately than others, can make a case for reparation. And we have seen that reparations have been successfully asked and given to tribal communities, mostly in Australia, in Canada, in New Zealand, the Maori New Zealand, the Aborigines in Australia, and the Inuit and other communities in Canada, which recently, and apologies as well. So the argument of reparation has emerged from the tribes of the world. And this is the first time we are trying to make an argument for the Dalits, the ex-untouchables, and the ex-caste slaves. I don't have much time, so I'll skip a lot. But if anyone is interested, these are my 5. So there's this publication, Historic Legacy of Untouchability and Caste Enslavement, the Case of Reparative Justice. Then there's a report, which is, I'm trying to work on it as a book, Untouchability and Slavery, Case of Reparations for India's Untouchables. Then a book chapter, The Persisting Development Gap, same. And the final and last latest, the Case of Dalit reparations that came out in Oxford Economic Policy. So we know that reservations have been critical for emancipating the tribals and Dalits to begin with, and now OBC, now even EWS has come. And however, the scope of jobs in the total economy where reservations apply has come down to only 3%, from 6%. So all this talk about sub-classification, reservation, everything which you hear in the media, parliament, census and contestation is just for a sliver 3% of all of India's jobs. So that is one thing to keep in mind. And it's impossible to think of many people that they would be in places like JNU studying or in many other governments or even other sectors had they not accessed reservation. So you look around you and you find first generation or second generation learners. Rarely will you find a third generation learner. There's a recent data set which is out, and Satish Deshpande, who analyzes caste and writes about it, was in my center, and he says that looking at the data, you find that 70% of males today are first generation learners and 90% are women are first generation. So you can imagine the role reservation we have played in giving access. And this is shrinking because, as Meenaji said, Udarikaran, globalization, shrinking of the public sector, PSUs being sold off, government jobs being casualized, B, C and D, contractualized, etc. So the reservation scope is reduced. And the places where you have reservations, like educational institutions, etc., the elite institutions like IITs, IIMs, and universities, you see the share of reserve students is going down. JNU is lower by 24%. In IIT, you have 12 or 14 suicides of reserve category students. AIMS, there's a report on exclusion and discrimination. And now you see the judiciary, the legislative, and the media, and the private sector, the share of SC, ST, OBC is obviously very, very, we don't even have figures, credible figures. Judiciary, you know what is the situation. Now, the thing to remember is that the representation you see of SC, ST, OBC is, which they have accessed in the last 75 years, is by sheer hard work. It is not that at the time of independence they had something. They had to start from scratch. Why? Because at the time of independence, they hardly had any access to land, assets, hardly any assets, wealth, access to education was denied to them, civil, political, social rights, they did not have till Ambedkar Sahab came on the scene and gave them political rights, but he said that till you have social and economic equality, this project will fail, which we see is failing. And along with that, they had to take before independence, just before at the cusp of independence, deal with untouchability, residential and physical segregation, and caste slavery, which we really don't talk about. I'm not going to go into the atrocities data. I'm just going to quickly say that of the total marginal land holdings in India, largest share is of the SCs, 85% are landless, the closest are Muslims, but half of them live in urban areas. And as you grow up the land ownership category, you find OBC and higher caste Hindus, and even a little bit, tribes are doing a little better, but at high level of land ownership, there is no representation from SC, ST, very minuscule from OBC, none from Muslims, and mostly from higher caste. If you look at the share of SC, ST in the overall population and their share of the land owned between 2003 and 13, you see that the population shares are not really reflected in land ownership for SC. Their population share is about 20%, but land share is less than 10. SCs closer to their population share, 11-13. OBC again close, 44-45, and others disproportionately higher land ownership, 23% population, 32% land ownership. Wealth inequality. So what I'm trying to say is that land, wealth, education, health, in all these indicators, and I'll not go into it in detail, I have all the figures here. You find that the lowest achievements are seen for the tribals and the SC, tribes more so than SC. In some cases it's equal, like in mortality rates, it's very, very similar. Poverty fell between 2005 and 11, the largest single reduction in poverty we saw after independence. But you see the relative difference. The orange bar is the poverty in 2004-5, and the dark bars are the poverty that fell. But the relative difference between Adivasi, Dalit, Muslim, OBC remains. The gap is not getting filled up. Whether we did closed economy socialism or after socialism we are doing liberalization, why isn't the gap not reducing? In fact, if you look at World Inequality Lab or Oxford report, I'm not going to go into that, India is now one of the most inequitous countries in the world. 4% of the top population, to them accrues 75% of our GDP. With this dubious distinction we have achieved in the last 7 to 10 years. America took much longer to achieve that dubious distinction. So, I was fortunate to be part of a commission on reparations, which was initiated by Harvard Medical School and Lancet International Journal, which is a health journal. And in that there were 10 groups who were asking for compensation for communities all over the world. And these are in front of you. The black population or the African American descendants of slaves in North America, the indigenous black population of South African apartheid, the original indigenous inhabitants of South Africa where you had apartheid, the Caribbean slaves, the Roma or the Romani people in Europe who left India in the 13th century and have faced the worst atrocities you can imagine. There's a book out by Margaret Metache and also another Jacqueline Bhawa, who's at Harvard. They document this. Women who are victims of war and conflict, and the Native American Canadian tribes. You know the genocide of the Native Americans, 450 to 500 tribes, relegated to now reservation and reservation land in America. Reparations for them. The Congolese people, Congo was the colony of the Belgian King Leopold, who just decimated the population. The most atrocious crimes you can not even imagine. Then reparations for Latin American and African countries who suffered from the debt trap of IMF and World Bank. There's a person at SOAS who's asking for reparations for them. And we had the opportunity to ask for reparations for the ex-untouchables and the ex-caste enslaved and climate reparations. So why am I asking for reparations? Why should we think about reparations? When we compared all these groups, we found that the Dalits, the untouchables, who also suffer from caste slavery, have suffered the longest in the history of any group in the world. This is a 2,500 year history of caste, untouchability in caste slavery. No other group, the Romani people, the African American slave trade, you pick anyone, except women maybe. Women are the only group who have suffered longer. So this is the longest group which has suffered in the history. That's the first thing you realize. So discrimination, exclusion, humiliation, degradation, violence, and so this 2,500 years of this suffering must have unique and severe down the stream effects on the present descendants. I mean, to imagine that our ancestors have suffered for so long and it was not going to have an effect on us, economically, socially, culturally, politically, psychologically, traumatically, even genetically, is something we need to start thinking about. It affects us in many, many ways, which we don't realize. So reservations are mitigating continuing exclusion and discrimination. You are extremely well educated, you go to the private sector, they'll reject you because you're tribal, Dalit, Bahujan. Then it doesn't matter. So reservation is there to give you representation in the current period of time. Your second generation, third generation, educated, elite, doesn't matter. You're excluded on the basis of your caste or your identity as a tribe or as a Muslim. What about historic exclusion and discrimination? We have not been compensated for that. For 2,500 years, the labor of the Shudra and the Ati Shudra, they are fixed they're like the surplus labor, always, the reserve army of labor, whose work leads to profit, and that profit goes up the caste hierarchy and is enjoyed by the Savarnas. And that profit is passed down intergeneration. Right? So they had access to education, land, wealth accumulation, etc., which they called merit, which is basically this privilege. And the systematic exclusion, discrimination, exploitation of this 80%, 70% of our population, our ancestors, is the reason why they claim they are better than us. Because they are the beneficiaries of that slave labor. They are the beneficiaries of the Shudra labor, which a Shudra is supposed to do hereditarily for thousands of generations. So it's like a captive labor which will not have mobility, which cannot own the means of production, which cannot enjoy the fruits of their labor, and it all will be sucked out and go to the top few varnas. And they can then use it the way they want and transfer it intergeneration. So there, the negative effect of our exploitation is the mirror of which is the flip side, is the positive development and growth of the Savarnas or for instance the whites compared to the blacks as slaves. Exactly the same logic. There is a 400-year history, ours is a 2,500-year history. So we don't have anything to counter that effect, which we suffer. The only example you have is this scheme which Congress party did briefly in Karnataka out of political reasons. It's called Dalit Bandhu, which was implemented in the Huzurabad district of, Telangana, where 17,000 families received a one-time cash transfer of 10 lakh rupees. It's like a reparation. And then there is a professor at Mr. Iyer at Harvard, who along with a bureaucrat in RA, analyzed the scheme. The paper is online available. I can share with anyone who wants to. And they analyze what is the effect of this one-time cash transfer. And they find tremendous benefit to the Dalit family. They buy land, they buy assets, tractor, they buy vehicles for personal commercial use, they repair their house, they send their kids to private schools, they pay donation fees. It's an immense one-time shot, like a steroid shot in your arm, and immediately a rise in wealth and even status. The other groups, the upper caste, they find that, the study finds that they are respected more, their confidence goes up, etc. The backlash effect is that now the upper caste is saying, so now they are doing as well as us, so they should get some subsidy in credit, or the other schemes for them should apply. But this is done, this is the example, and this is being done. Now, so we try to see where does caste come from, how did it change? I am talking about 2,500 years history. So we examined historical studies, and historians have done some decent job of identifying origins of caste. So we start right from the Vedic period, from the Purusha Sutta in the Rig Veda to the Dharma Sutras, then Manu's compilation of it, Arthashastra, all that through the medieval period and to the British period in 1843, where the British bring in the Anti-Slavery Act. So the first thing that we realized as we talk about untouchability, but we don't talk about caste slavery. Certain castes were designated as slave castes. The word pariah in English comes from the pariah caste in Kerala, the Chermuras and others who were born as slaves. And we found estimates of those in a thesis, which is now also a book, by Christina Mulfenter, who did her PhD in Rochester under Subrata Mitra. And she compiled all the data from the 18th century, where surveys happened in India, apart from the census surveys. And they measured, they counted the number of slaves. So like for instance, in 1841, British India, the estimate is 1 crore 50 lakh slaves. This is Adam's reference. Then again, British India, 1873, 5 crore 41 lakh 35,000 slave population. So Adam is deposing in front of the British government, a British anti-slavery committee in the British Parliament, and he says, oh, these are estimates, but there are anywhere between 10 million to 20 million aggressive slaves in India. And many of them are caste slaves. Not all are caste slaves, but many of them are caste slaves. Now British bring the Anti-Slavery Act in 1833 for British, the UK, not UK, but Britain and its colonies. So they get into contracts with anti-slavery contracts with Persia, with Belgium, and all that. In India, they take 10 years more. They bring it after 10 years in 1843. Why? Because when asked, the Viceroy of India writes a letter saying that no, this is not slavery of the very vicious kind of the African American or the African slave trade. This is very, very nice slavery. You know, the slave master takes care of the slave, they have a symbiotic relationship. In times of hardship, the master, in famine and etc., the master gives them food and all that. Oh, it's not bad, let's not bother with it. Of course, India was the jewel in the crown and the largest source of wealth drain, so they needed the slaves. So the slaves are coming all from the low caste, the untouchable caste. The revenue is extracted by the upper caste who own the land, who are doing business, who are lending to the British. They are employing these. They are making a cut and passing it on to the British. So most of the work is done by the slaves. So, what are the, I'm not going to go into Locke's argument for reparation. Locke is also problematic, but the argument for reparation starts with Locke in the 17th century. In fact, he writes in the 16th something, and I'm not going to go into that. So the first argument, I'm just going to make 3 slides, 3 arguments in stock, is why reparations. The first is that if your ancestors as untouchables or caste slaves were harmed, there is a cause and effect link. That harm done to them is not restricted to that generation. It is passed on through economics, wealth, land, social, and all kinds of other disadvantages. Psychological, trauma is passed on through even genetics. I mean, there are studies which show that if you face a traumatic incident, your gene switches because there is historic trauma and the gene is predisposed to behave. You can have anxiety, depression, ADHD. This is published research. So the trauma is passed on, it's not in the past, first of all. And it manifests in their descendants. Therefore, since transgressions of caste untouchability, caste enslavement harm present-day descendants, they have right to reparations against those who committed those transgressions. So we have a right to reparation for the transgressions that were done to our ancestors. That's the harm argument. Inheritance argument is that when these transgressions were done, if slavery was banned by British in 1843, that means why did they ban slavery? Because they thought it's wrong, it's a crime, it's against humanity. So if a crime is done, you have to either give a punishment or a compensation. So when Lincoln abolished African American slavery, he promised 40 acres and a mule to every family of 4 members, which never really happened. But when the British formally abolished caste slavery in India under Act 5 in 1843, they announced no compensation. They did not define slavery also. They only used the IPC. You cannot abduct, traffic, harm, or force a person into labor. So they used the already existing IPC laws to kind of create a anti-slavery act, but did not define slavery. They did not define the time limit by which the act will come into being, and they left it on the magistrates, etc., locally to decide on any case, in case a slave owner goes to court and asks for his or her freedom. So they kept it very nebulous. So had they offered compensation, that every slave owner who owns slaves should now compensate, then the situation would have been different. Since it wasn't offered, their descendants have the right for that compensation. So as a consequence, because compensation was not offered, slaves could not leave their masters. They were not called slaves then because the law is not, the law changed, but they worked as bonded labor, indentured labor, attached labor. They continued to work under their slave masters. And the Bonded Labor Act comes in 1976, and finally it is implemented in 1990. So all the bonded labor population that you saw after independence are basically is a continuation of slavery, caste slavery, a large section of it which we don't realize. So they and their descendants need reparations because the reparation should have been given in 1843, compensation should have been given, the compensation is due now. And finally, the spiritual renewal argument says that first and foremost thing to do is to accept that there is an historic harm that was done. A historic wrong was done. We enslaved millions of people. Where is this acknowledgement? By the slave owners or the British even. And if a harm is done, only then you can apologize. First you accept you harmed millions of people, you apologize for it, and you compensate for it. Unless this comes from the oppressor community, the country, the nation, its spirit cannot move forward. You cannot go on a path of healing, a path of growth. And the idea of development, that we should have these concrete jungles and cars as opposed to green spaces and natural resources, itself is a capitalist project coming from this colonial and caste-based exploitation, slavery. And we must, as Meenaji very rightly said, this is a combined cause of the tribes and the so-called scheduled caste and Dalit population. And the slaves which I talk about included tribes. And the argument for tribes also needs to be. I'll stop here. Thank you.